I want to start with how I found your book, just very briefly, because I think it's a kind of a fun story. So my father is also a survivor, so I'm also a so-called second generation, and my mother is an American-born Jew, and they are both avid readers. And my mother used to be the head of the Denver Jewish Film Festival, the Denver Jewish Book Festival, I'm sorry. And whenever I would go over their house, I obviously looked through these stacks of books because she pretty much got everything. And I was there a number of years ago, and this black book with like blood red lettering jumped out at me, said Jew Boy. And I was totally intrigued by the title. So I picked up the book and read the back, was more intrigued. And my father happened to walk in the room, and I asked him, I said, Dad, have you read this book, The Jew Boy? And he looked at me and went, "Urgh," which is how he used to react to listening to me listen to punk music in my bedroom when I was a kid. So that made me even more intrigued. And I sat down and I read the book because they let me take it, and I was immediately blown away. Not only did it hit me as a second generation myself, but I found it just totally raw and subversive and irreverent and unsentimental and totally hilarious and intense and scary at the same time. And I would love to know where you were in your life, at what point you were in your life, and what the impetus was that started you off on writing this.
Okay, well, I think I started writing this book in my head when I was like 10 years old. And I announced to everybody in the family I was going to be a writer. And I started kind of storing up memories and images and conversations. I don't think I was doing it knowingly, but I started storing these images and conversations up. And just to jump ahead to the 1990s, I was living in San Francisco. And I was part of this poetry scene, the spoken word poetry scene. And I was getting lots of invitations to perform in Europe. And then I got an invitation to perform in Germany. And I was like, I'm not going to do that. And but a friend of mine said, you really ought to do that. You ought to go. So I went to Germany, and I ended up getting like 5 invitations back to back to go to Germany, come back, go to Germany, come back, and perform Germany and Austria and Holland. And so I began to kind of live a double life on these performance tours. I performed with Allen Ginsberg there and Kathy Acker, and where by day I'd be hanging out with the avant-garde, and then I'd sneak off and go to visit Dachau or Mauthausen, Frankfurt Jewish Cemetery. And I had visiting these places really woke me up about what the Holocaust could have meant or been. And when I came back from the 5th tour, I said, that's it, I'm not going on any more of these tours. And I sat down in this cafe and I began to write. And I wrote 1,200 pages by hand. And then I put it all away on a bookshelf and forgot about it. And another friend of mine said, whatever happened to the 1,200 pages you wrote? I said, I wrote it, that's it, it's out of me. He said, well, why don't you try to get it published? I said, nobody would read that. Because at that time, there were no second generation memoirs. There was Art's, Spiegelman's, Mao's, and I knew Art and Françoise Mouly from 1984. We were all invited to this gathering of artists and writers by Eva Fogelman. She invited us. We got together and we all kind of stood around with our hands in our pockets, and then we ran out of there. That was the first 2G meeting of writers and artists. And but nobody had done this, and I didn't believe anybody would want to publish it or read it. And it turned out to be wrong.
So take us to the next step. So how did you get it published? What was the next?
I wrote to a couple of literary agents. 3 wrote back saying they want to see 50 to 100 pages, sent it off, and then a literary agent in New York and one in San Francisco said they want to represent it. So here in New York was Peter Ruby Associates. And they actually sent out a representative, June Clark. She flew out and said, yeah, we want to represent the book. We love it, blah, blah, blah. Next thing I knew, they were sending it out to publishers. Here's where the story gets a little weird. 3 months later, I was sitting in the Harvard Club as a guest for another completely unrelated reason. And I get a call from June saying there's an editor who wants to talk to you about your book at Farrar Straus. He was an imprint called From. So I jump in a cab and I go over to meet him. His name was Fred Jordan. He was partners with a guy named Barney Rossett. They started Grove Press. Grove Press were the people who published, Henry Miller, Jack Kerouac, Jean Paul Sartre, all that. Really significant pair of editors. And Fred had a British accent and said that his mother died at Auschwitz, and that my book has really moved him, and he wants to publish it. I couldn't believe it. He said he wants to publish it. I also remembered him from when I was a kid. I used to collect comic books. My brother and I would collect comic books, but we were very poor, and we thought that we'd become comic book collecting millionaires. But our mother threw out all our first editions, as you heard. And when we would collect these comics, we would go to these secondhand bookstores that they were sold mainly smut and comic books in the Bronx. We grew up in the Bronx. And they always invariably had a box of magazines of Evergreen Review, which was published by Barney and Fred. And I remembered from when I was a kid that the first literary figures I heard of were Barney Rossett and Fred Jordan. Here he was, saying, I want to publish the book in hardcover. And then later, Barney Rossett jumped in and published it in paperback. So that was a completely crazy, for me, miracle. Anyway, that's the story of how it got published.
Mm-hmm. So why don't you give us a little bit of I'm sure you could spend all night on this, but maybe just in a shortened form, your mom's backstory a bit, since so much of that informs this book and then a lot of your other work.
So my mother was from Paris. Her family was from Warsaw, Polish Jews. And my father was a Bronx street guy, third generation Bronx, but they came from Russia, the Jews from Russia. So when my mother was 12, the Nazis invaded France, came to Paris, and in July 21, 1942, she was wearing the Jewish star, and she got when she was walking down the street, and she happened to pass by a car when a German officer, was getting out of the car, and she kind of got in his way, and he beat her to the sidewalk. But nothing more than that had happened, and they got arrested. The Germans came and rounded up all the Jews of Polish descent living in Paris. It was something like 20,000, with the objective to send them to the Velodrome d'Hiver, the winter sports palace, and then from the Velodrome d'Hiver to Drancy, and then to Auschwitz, which was the route that they all went. And now my mother's brothers had all gone to the south of France, had hid in the south. They were hidden in various convents and Catholic schools. They were hidden among Christians. But the mother and the grandmother, my mother and her mother, remained believing that, they all believed that the Germans were not going to trouble the women. So in the main, the people who were arrested on that day were women and children. And so what happened was they came up, and it was French gendarmes. The SS were in the street, the Germans, the Wehrmacht were in the streets. It was French gendarmes who went up into the apartments and had lists And they came up to my grandmother, and they said, we're looking for, and they named the father and the brothers, and she said, well, they're not here, they're on vacation in the South. And I said, okay, well, Marie Jush, that was my mother, and then they named my grandmother, Hannah, and they said, take with you a certain number of kilos of clothing and pack some food and your possessions and come downstairs. And my mother wrote this incredible letter where she wrote a series of letters to me about these experiences, but where she remembers like looking out into the courtyard and seeing like her best friend's family, which was a big family with babies and young children with suitcases coming downstairs. All of them perished at Auschwitz. And my grandmother, Hannah, told my mother, take one sweater with no star in it and put it on your arm. And she took a sweater with no star and put it on her arm. Because the dresses and all their garments had stars. And they went downstairs just like that with no possessions, with only a sweater on their arm. And so when they got downstairs, the French gendarme who had arrested them said, where's your stuff? And she said, where we're going, we're not going to need anything. And my mother recounts how she began to cry. She realized that they're going to die. And the gendarme says, you're going to need to have food with you and clothes, so you have to go get some food. She said, we have nothing. We're not going to buy anything. We're not bringing anything. We're going to go like this. So the French gendarme looked across the street. There was a boulangerie, bakery. And he said, why don't you go across the street and get yourself some bread? And they put on their sweaters with no stars. They went and they ran around the corner, and they kept running. And from there began a journey. And my mother writes in the letter how she saw these trucks pulling away with people waving, all dead. Anyway, they began a journey that took them into the south of France. And they hid in the south of France for 2 years. And then when Mussolini fell, Hitler came into the south of France. I think it was with the Adolf Hitler Division. And then they went into Italy. And the Italian army was in Italy, the south of Italy, north of Italy, or south of France. They retreated into the north of Italy. And my mother and her mother went with the Italian army into the north of Italy. In the north of Italy, they were with 30 Jews in a truck. 28 of the Jews got off in a town right before the town that they ended up in, which is Diamante, and were all sent to Auschwitz. But my mother and her mother stayed in the truck and went into Diamante, and Diamante was the center of the communist resistance against the Nazis. And they ended up with the resistance. And my mother, so she was with the resistance, the Italian resistance, for 2 years. And then, and there's more, there's a whole bunch more. But anyway, that's basically the rough outline of that story.
So with survivors, by and large, a lot of survivors that had kids, started families afterwards. I have friends whose parents were survivors that never spoke about their experience in the war. And my father spoke about it. He would come to schools. He still does that. He's still around and speaking. But it wasn't until I was an adult that I really realized that he was kind of touching upon kind of the easiest parts of his story to tell. Not easiest, but at least the most accessible and less painful. Now, with your mom, the way you describe her in the book, it seems like she was sharing a lot with you at a very young age, right?
Yeah, her stories were very graphic. People she saw hung, shot, terrible things she saw. Were my Harry Potter stories. And I loved them. When I was like 5, 6, 7, she would, what happened was when she was 5, she lost a baby at term. Until 5, she never talked about the Holocaust. And just to say that at that time, you know, we're talking about the 1950s, nobody talked about the Holocaust. The Holocaust was, you know, a hidden subject. People were not proud or didn't want to talk about the Holocaust. She had one friend, Ruth, who had been in Auschwitz, who was a German Jew and had numbers on her arm, and she would come over, but nobody, there was no like organizations.
Well, there wasn't even a word for it by that point. Nobody
There
even
was
called
even
it.
no word for
It was
it.
just part of the war.
People didn't talk about it.
Was did you get the sense that you know, survivors often talked about either kind of an inner toughness to be able to survive, how it was the soft ones never survived, but then there's also a question of luck and those things that happen along the way. Did you get a sense from her that she was trying to pass on to you something about toughness or about luck or all of the above or none of the above?
She was terrified of Gentile people, of non-Jews, terrified. In many ways, she was still in hiding. I grew up with my mother was in hiding. You know, she's very isolated. She was this French Jew from Paris with these, you know, married to this you know, guy with a third-grade education who was a gambler and involved in petty crime stuff. And she was very isolated. She had no one to talk to. I was the person. I was her confidant. Now later, you know, a psychologist wrote a book called The Memorial Candles, in which she claims that in each family of a survivor, one child is appointed by the survivor or survivors to carry the message of the Holocaust forward. So I received from my mother a kind of special education. It was very brutal, but it was very effective. I'm quite sure if I hadn't gotten that from her, I would never have written any of this stuff. My brother could not care less about the Holocaust. It's completely, you know, ESPN, the Jets, you know, he doesn't want to talk about it, he doesn't want to know about that. To him, it's a bunch of morbid nonsense, and, you know, let's get on with life. But I was definitely the appointed one. And I had a lot of motivation. I mean, it was instilled in me. It was instilled in me with beatings, with unbelievable stories. My mother was a great storyteller.
Now, when you say beatings, I mean, there's some really intense sections of the book. Do you feel like these were? I mean, a lot of survivors came back with a lot of anger. I know my father. I have older siblings, and my father was very intense with them, and I came along a lot later. So by the time I came around, he had mellowed. But what was this mostly? Do you think it was directly connected to her survival?
Yeah. Well, I think what happened was, I mean, until we were 5. You know, I have a fraternal twin brother, Howard. My mother was just the best, happiest, nicest mom ever in the world, which is lucky. I mean, so in this very formative first 5 years, I had a very happy experience. But she lost a baby at term. She lost a little girl at term. And when she came back who had blonde hair and blue eyes like her, my mother, and when she came back from the hospital, she was a changed person. I think she had severe postpartum depression, and I think she was shocked at the loss of the child. And I think she had invested a lot of hope in this little girl, you know, that she was going to somehow be able to provide for the childhood that she didn't have. I mean, my mother was feeding machine gun bullets when she was 14, you know. So I think she had so much hope pinned on this little girl, and when that baby died, it changed her. And she was isolated and alone. My father was never at home. And she would explode in anger and start beating me. And then after the beatings, she would sit down on the bed with a valise, a suitcase. She called it the valise, that had pictures of a lot of people who had died from her family and from friends. She had pictures of their pictures in a valise. And she would look through the pictures and tell me stories. She had pictures of like resistance units, photograph of them. She would tell me all these stories. And then we would achieve this kind of peaceful, this harmony, this moment of harmony around these terrible memories. And I would feel close to my mother and feel a lot of love for her. I was very loyal. You know, the children are very loyal. I was very loyal to her. So.
Did you speak about her survival at all to the outside world, to your peers?
No. I was like this fat little Jewish kid, grew up in the Bronx, and until I was like 13, 14, I was being beaten up. My brother and I were being beaten up, and we grew up in a hard place, and then my body began to change, and by the time I was 15, I was 6 feet tall, and by the time I was 16, I was really not the same kid. I mean, I was the one who was chasing. I was doing the beating of people, and playing football for Duality High School, and running with some really crazy characters. And I think I was, in some ways, I was kind of like anti-Semitic. I hated Jewish stuff. I didn't want to have anything to do with Jews, the Holocaust. I was sick of all that. And I wanted to, I started reading Jack Kerouac. And I wanted to like hop freights and write novels and do all that kind of stuff. And what happened was, when I was 19, I hopped a freight. I hitchhiked with my friend George, who was also kind of anti-Semitic a little bit. We hitchhiked to Colorado. And then we hung out in Colorado for a week, and then we took a bus to Cheyenne, Wyoming. And in Cheyenne, Wyoming, we hopped a freight train to North Platte, Nebraska, which was a hump yard where they break up the trains, and we got arrested. We got arrested by the North Platte police, and I've met people from Nebraska, and I mentioned I was in jail back then in North Platte, and they were like, wow, you got out of there alive? You were Jewish? I mean, it was really anti-Semitic. Like when I was filling out the arrest form, it says, what's your religion? And I said, I wrote Jew. And I remember the guy who looked at it, the sheriff who looked at it, he goes, oh, you're from Jew York. And I knew I was in trouble. And it was a bad night in that jail cell. So when I came back from there, I was very haunted by what happened. I went to Hillel. There was a Hillel on campus, and I went to Hillel, and I told the rabbi, Arthur Zuckerberg, I'll never forget. And he goes, so let's say you were on a freight train, and then you got arrested, and you were like abused in the prison, in the jail. He goes, what does that sound like to you? I said, I don't know. He goes, well, didn't your mother, because I told him about my mother. He said, isn't that kind of like the Holocaust a little bit in a symbolic way? I said, oh yeah. So I started taking Jewish studies courses, and I studied with Elie Wiesel and Yitz Greenberg.
So you bring up the comic books, the football, riding the rails, going out west. Now I know that you're very involved in a kind of American folk scene. Like a lot of children of immigrants, I'm sure there is that wrestling with the duality of being an American versus being, a child of wherever your parents were from. But there's also this other level of being second generation. How does that feed into what you tried to pursue in your life at a certain point?
Well, until that experience in Nebraska, I was running away. And then when I came back from that experience, and I studied with Elie Wiesel, and in the first course on literature of the Holocaust, Menachem Rosensaft was the teaching assistant. And suddenly I began to aspire to maybe express Jewish things in my writing. Another thing is that when I was in high school, at Duality High School, from the football team, there was this guy, Fred Johnson, who was an African-American guy, and he said to me, you ought to read this book, and it was Black Boy by Richard Wright. And I really, really related to this book. There was nothing, I wasn't aware of the ascendancy of American Jewish literature or anything like that, Partisan Review. I didn't know any of that stuff. But I read Black Boy, and then he gave me another book to read. He gave me Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice. And so this idea of emerging African-American identity and self-defense and exploration of ethnic issues my entree to that was through African American literature. And I'm not saying that to be politically correct and all this stuff. That really was what happened. I mean, there was no Jewish literature I knew of. I didn't know what that would be. I wouldn't know where to look. He kind of gave me these books to read, and I was fascinated. And so there was a seed planted too, there, that maybe you can write about your experiences in those terms, and that's legitimate literature. So, I mean, it's no accident that when I wrote my memoir, I called it Jew Boy. And people are like, oh, where'd you get that? I say, well, I got that from Richard Wright, Black Boy.
So when you were talking about earlier your high school days, or maybe even earlier, kind of wanting to forget the whole thing and kind of just be an American kid, et cetera, and how your brother is kind of just not, he's just into the Jets, he doesn't give a shit.
He's a great guy, my brother.
I don't doubt it. But it's funny because with having one side of my family is American Jews. The other side, which is a very small side, is my dad's side, and they're all over, scattered throughout the world. And I always differentiate between the two because not only is one a lot bigger and the other one's kind of tiny, there is this they're different people from myself and my siblings in many ways. The whole notion of like never forget on that side, whereas my siblings and I, it's almost like we're kind of cursed in a way to always remember. Like we can't go through life. I don't go through life without a single day going by where I don't think of something doesn't remind me of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, or my dad's story, or some level of it. And I wonder even about, I know you probably can't speak for Howie, but I'm curious. Can you really escape any of this stuff?
He did.
He did?
Yeah, he definitely did. Now, of course, there are certain things. He moved to Florida when he retired. He began to drive a pickup truck and to wear a gun in a holster, and had a German Shepherd, terrifying German Shepherd, riding along with him. Could that be a manifestation of something? Who knows? Yeah.
I mean, I don't even. Half the time when I'm riding the subway, I look at those tracks and immediately, or smokestacks out in the country. I see smokestacks on a hike. It comes to me immediately. It's sort of an inescapable reality. And these days, I don't know if when I was a kid, I came across Helen Epstein's Children of the Holocaust, and I think it was really the first time when I was a teenager that I read this book, and it's all based on interviews with children of Holocaust survivors. And it was really, for me, the first time that I began to put two and two together that, oh yeah, it's not just me. This is a whole generational thing and to different degrees based on who the parent was and how they passed things down. And I'm wondering, was there a point where that kind of clicked for you and you realized that this wasn't just about you, it was about there were other people?
Well, no, I mean, the point where that click happened, I mean, when I published Jew Boy, I completely, when it came out, I was terrified. I thought, I was on a book tour. They sent me all over the country, and they sent me to LA and Detroit and Chicago, New York. And I thought that, I had this image in my mind of like Holocaust survivors and their children, standing outside with protest signs and, kill Kaufman, And that's not what happened. What happened was they showed up. They were incredibly responsive and welcoming, and they bought the book, and they applauded what I had done. Yeah, and then on that book tour, that first book tour, I was in Palo Alto in a bookstore, Kepler's, and there was a Latina social worker sitting in the audience who came up and said, I've read your book, and I work with the children of Cambodian survivors of the Cambodian Holocaust, and I have them read your book, and they all tell me that your book is exactly the same as their experience. So that kind of opened the door in my thinking. And also, I just wanted to say that, when I was in college and studying with Elie Wiesel and all that, the term "never again," became very popular. Never again, never again. But it's happened a lot since then in other countries, and now there's this resurgence of anti-Semitism globally. It's happening again. I mean, I don't know what never again means. I see people on Facebook, they scream, never again, but it's happening again. And it's shocking to be a member of the second generation, or third generation, I'm sure, and see that happening again. It's kind of shocking, because I really did believe, I remember sitting in Ellie's class and thinking, this will never happen again. But it is happening again. The turning point also, the click happened when someone named Melvin Jules Bukirt called me up with another guy named Thane Rosenbaum. They were both on the phone, both second generation Holocaust novelists, and said, congratulations. I said, what for? And they said, you're in this anthology. We're putting you in this anthology called Nothing Makes You Free, Writings from Descendants of the Holocaust, of Holocaust Survivors. It was published by W.W. Norton. It's kind of this definitive anthology of second and third generation writers, mainly second. So then was the sense that when that book came out, that we were part of a group, that there was something. And we do, I hang out with Thane, and I run into Melvin once in a while. There is, and art, there is this kind of connection, in a sense, that we belong to a generation.
Were your parents alive when Jubilee came out?
My mother had passed away. My father was alive. My father never read anything I wrote. He just wasn't a reader. But one time I got a call from him, and I heard somebody yelling in the background, and he said, I'm very angry at what you wrote in that book of yours, Jew Boy. I said, oh yeah, so you read it? He goes, you wrote that your Aunt Ray has whore's eyes. And then I heard this voice in the background going, my mother didn't have no whore's eyes. My mother didn't have. So I go, who's that? He goes, that's your cousin Barbie, and she's really angry at what you wrote. So I'm disowning you. I said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Okay. Well, nice knowing you. And that was actually the longest conversation I ever had with my father. So a couple days later, he calls me up. So how you doing? I thought you disowned me. He goes, nah, your cousin Bobby was here driving me crazy, so I just said that to calm her down.
So he never read the book? No.
He was very proud, though, that his doctor had read the book. And my brother, I had another book, another memoir I wrote called Drunken Angel, and they made an audio book out of it, and the guy who reads the audio book was like some guy who starred in one of the Batman movies. And my brother called me up all excited about that. He didn't read the book either, but he's like, that guy from Batman is reading your book.
The guy from Batman. That's a review
I love
of
my
sorts,
family.
I suppose.
They're really,
So what I mean, this is a really deep question, but what was your relationship to Judaism, spirituality as a kid, and what is it now?
Well, I think that first of all, there was Yiddish. Like my parents spoke Yiddish when they didn't want me to understand anything. So there was Yiddish. So of course, I actually learned a little bit of Yiddish from trying to decipher what their secrets, I think Yiddish was an entree. When I was 19 or 20, my mother and father, in a kind of aside, we were having a little bit of a quarrel, mentioned that my great uncle had published a Yiddish newspaper. I was like, who was he? And they said it was Abraham Kahan. He published the Jewish Daily Forward, and he was a novelist. Never heard about this until that time. My grandmother was Beatrice Kahan. She was Abraham Kahan's first cousin. I went rushing down to the Jewish Daily Forward building on East Broadway, which at that point was sold to a Chinese church. and some Chinese guy was hanging laundry where they used to print the newspaper. There was this sense of it lurking in the background, but definitely, no question, the Holocaust was, like, I didn't know anything about Israel. Nobody ever talked about Israel in my family, like nothing.
And you guys really didn't go to synagogue, right?
I had a bar mitzvah, so-called. We used to have a dry goods salesman. He used to come around, and Mr. Unger used to come around and sell dry goods to my mother. I knew that because my mother was always sending me to the door to tell me we didn't have any money to pay him. He used to keep his accounts in this little notebook. I know your mother's in there. I said, no, my mom's not here. We're broke. We have no money. And he would sell like pillowcases and towels and underwear. He taught me my Haftorah phonetically. And he taught me about Moses and the flight from Egypt from a classics comic book. Like he brought a classics comic book, and I read that, and that was my Jewish studies. And I said my Haftorah phonetically. I didn't understand a word of it, but I still remember my Haftorah.
Wow.
I had no sense. Israel, I think the Holocaust was my real sense. The sense of, this had happened to Jews, that there had been an undertaking that was European-wide. My mother made that point to me. It wasn't just the Germans. It was most of Europe participated. It wouldn't have been possible to do without the participation of, foreign officers and such. So she gave me the sense that this was a European-wide activity and that the rest of the world didn't care. So that was haunting to me, as the fact that I was born a victim. So of course, when I found out that there was something called Israel, I ran to Israel. And I lived in Israel for 7 years. I made Aliyah. I served in the IDF. So I think my entree into Judaism had more to do with, the historical dimension, and the sense of a battle. It's a besieged position. But, lastly to say that I also had the sense of being a Jew means being an outsider, which was contradictory to the whole ascendant narrative of the American Jewish, post-war experience where we were moving towards the center. We're fighting to get to the center, which we no longer occupy. Shows how precarious that struggle can be. My sense was that we're Jews, we're outsiders. We're just self-appointed outsiders, right? We're chosen people, but also that the world doesn't want us ever for any good reason, which is proving again to be the case, I think. And so Israel to me was very important, is very important still. I have my daughter is Israeli. She served also in Zahal and lives there in Tel Aviv. I'm very happy about that. Very happy she lives in Tel Aviv.
Well, one quick thing.
I guess I'm a Zionist.
I guess. One quick thing, and then we'll go to audience questions. So the night of the election last year, seems like it was 5 years ago already, you and I were texting with each other. I was texting with my siblings, and I remember distinctly us having a tone of, yep, we expected this. This is going to happen inevitably, and I feel like most second generation grew up with this notion that this is inevitable, that the rugs will be taken out from under us at some point. And I wonder if in my adult life, as I've studied more and more about the psychology of second generation and of survivors, how do you differentiate between the kind of benign triggers in life versus the real threats, if I could put it that way?
Well, I mean, I think Trump is a problem, to say the least. And but I lived in Israel for 7 years, and when you live there and you're looking out at the world and how the world perceives you, very, very different. Very, very different. The Israelis look at things differently than we do here. What they perceive as a threat, and I think that here we're in trouble. I don't think we're in trouble in Israel. I think we're in trouble here, which is such a strange thing. I mean, for the last 50 years, I've always thought of Israel as being the country that's in trouble. But I don't think so. I think we're in trouble. I mean, the Iran deal, I think, is problematic, and the nuclear threat is real, and I think that's scary. But that aside, I think we're in trouble here. I just do. Even though Trump has come out as pro-Israel, and he seems to be pro-Israel, but he's not.
When you say we, you mean Jews?
I think everyone. We Jews are in trouble here. I think we're going to become the focus increasingly. In fact, we are increasingly the focus of a lot of blame from both ends. That's the position that we were in before World War II. The left and the right opposed us, found us to be objectionable. The left found us to be as objectionable as the right did. The fact that there were many Jews gravitating towards the left, because there was no real established position, in the before World War II, for a Jew to obtain by. Zionism was a kind of risky, weird thing to them. So they all a lot of them ran to socialism and communism and, embraced that, but there too, they were not acceptable. And a lot of them recount that, remember that. And then, of course, on the right and the far right, they were targets for murder. So I think, we're not in that place yet, but I think we're moving into that place. I think there's big forces of history that are moving to replicate that experience for us again. And I think we're not going to find friends on the left or the right. And in fact, on the left, and I consider myself, as the Labor Party in Israel and the Maharach. I wrote for the Maharach magazines. I found a lot of anti-Semitism on the left as much as on the right. I just do. I see it. And it's weird. I mean, it's just something you can't really talk about with people, but it's there. So
let's go to audience questions. If anyone has anything, we have a microphone that will travel to you. If anyone has any, just make something up. What was it? How did they meet?
You should probably ask me that after. I mean, I heard many different stories, of course, But the two stories that stick out in my mind, one was from my Uncle Arnold, who was, a criminal and who had two sons that died at Rikers Island for murder and attempted murder. He said that my mother came over, she was beautiful, young, innocent woman, and my father, who was not innocent but was devastatingly handsome, and, was compromising her, and put her in a compromising position. That's what he said. I won't tell you the exact words because they're really crude. And then my Aunt Beatrice in Paris, I asked her, how did my mother and father, because that haunted me. How did these two people end up together? And she said, your mother wanted to marry an American so that she could have children in America. When I was in Paris in 2002, on my way to Israel again, I was walking around thinking, maybe I have some connection to this place, France. So when I came back, my mother was gone, but I had all her papers or documents, and I went to the French consulate, and I put them out on the table of the consul, and I said, do I have any connection to France? He said, where's your livre de famille, family book? So there was a livre de famille. He looked through it, he goes, yes, you and your brother are French citizens. I said, what? What are you talking about? He says, yes, you're French. He says, look here, French citizens. Your mother, he said, registered you and your brother when you were 1 year old with the French consulate in New York, and we've kept track of you ever since. And you have a French birth certificate. So I called up my father, and I said, which I have the French thing. I even have a card that says I'm a Cartiste de Matriculation, that I'm a French resident in San Francisco. It's weird. I called my father up. I said, Pop, did you know that Howie and I are French citizens? He goes, you're not no French citizens, you're American. I said, no, but we are. We're French citizens. When Mom registered us, when we were a year old with the French consulate. Did you know that? So that's not, that. He didn't know. And I realized that she did that in order to be able to escape with my brother and I in the event that things didn't work out with my father. So now I have 3 citizenships, American, Israeli, and French, 3 passports.
Can I ask you another question? Did your mother have a lot of secrets that she actively created aside from your family? Was she out and about doing?
Oh, was she playing on my phone? Nah, she was walking around in a schmata and moo-moo. You know, no, not my mother. She was thinking that maybe things weren't going to work out with this guy. My father was not a typical nice guy, you know. But he stayed with her. He stayed with her. And, you know, the thing we used to hear all the time was, don't aggravate your mother. She was in the war.
Yeah. And it's not uncommon for survivors to, you know, my dad to this day can't leave the house without a bag full of food. Yeah. You know, you never know what's going to happen. He might be stuck without food, you know, or you might need to just hightail it the hell out of the country one day, you know? So, any other audience questions?
Would you ever move back to Israel?
Probably not. Not that I don't love Israel, but you know, the Israel under Netanyahu, it's not the political dimension, it's the economic. You know, what it's become, this capitalist, hyper-capitalist, thing. I don't really like that. My daughter's there, though, so, you know, I'm not going to not go. And, of course, I love Israel. I went back and served in 2003. I served in Zahal. They were asking for veterans of the Lebanon War to come back because the young troops were kind of nervous in the kind of activity that they had to do. So they asked the older guys to come back and serve and kind of be a steady hand, and so I did. I served in 2003 outside of Jenin. It was the capital of suicide bombing, and we were hunting suicide bombers. And, of course, I was useless as a soldier. I couldn't even see they had us doing training, and I couldn't see the targets. And there was this young sharpshooter next to me, and he says, "Al tidag," and he was shooting my target. And then the sergeant came by and said, "Kaufman, Mitsuyan, bullseye," you know. So, but I was useless as a soldier. But I was able to keep a steady, when we went into operations, I was able to keep a steady hand in there. That was, you know, just to be an older figure.
What positives do you take away as a second generation person?
Can everybody hear the questions? He asked, what positive things do you take away from being second generation?
Well, I think we're, Bruce.
Very good.
Oh, thank you, Bruce.
Very good.
I think that we are bearers of history, that we bear the history of our parents. And so we have a responsibility, a job to do, to inform the world of what happened. That I think is an important, meaningful task. Not everybody has that task. And also, I think that, you know, I went to see, when I was young, I went to see Isaac Bashevis Singer, and who received me. And, you know, he knew about, you know, my great uncle and all this. And so I was talking to him about the Holocaust. And he said, look, he said, in Jewish culture, when a wedding meets a funeral in the road, a wedding procession meets a funeral procession, the wedding procession has the right of way. So it's given me the sense that life is the most important thing, and that we have to do whatever we can to preserve life. I mean, death is, you know, a big part of our life, but we have to live. We have to propagate that which is life-giving. And I think that's very meaningful for people who are second generation. I think the sense that life must be lived to the fullest, not wasted, and that we have to help others, if we can, to live very important. So,
Yeah.
Why would you like to live in Israel if it's so much better than America? America is in trouble.
why what?
Why wouldn't
you
you?
like to live in Israel? They are better, and America is in trouble.
So the question is,
think-
why wouldn't you
why
want?
wouldn't I live
why
in
would he
Israel?
not want to live in Israel?
I think I'm a prisoner of my language. Of the English, I feel like a prisoner of the English language. Probably my chief reason for being here is the English language. I lived in Israel for 7 years. I spoke Hebrew. אני מדבר בעברית.
In 7 years, you didn't live.
No, אני מדבר בעברית. But it does. I don't feel the language the way I feel English. What can I say? It's just a fact. My publishers are here, and my language is here. I'm here almost solely because of that. Yeah, I don't love America anymore or what it's become. I don't feel any connection to that. But the language I still love.
You ever write in Hebrew?
No,
write
I could barely write my name in Hebrew. I was terrible in writing and reading. I was very slow. I learned how to speak in the army, because if you don't learn how to speak, you're in trouble. You have to take orders, and so you have to be able to. So I learned how to speak well, and I can speak well. I can hold my own conversation. But reading and writing, I'm not fluent. When I'm there, I think in Hebrew. When I'm in France, I think in French. My first language was French. I spoke French before I spoke English with my mother. My father made my mother stop speaking French to us. But yeah, when you're in that country, you think in the language. And I begin to think in the language, yes, absolutely. And I actually become a different person because of the language. I become the person of the language.
So why don't we do one more question, then you're going to do some reading, correct?
Well, let's go with the credit.
Okay.
Where in the Bronx did you grow up?
Where in the Bronx?
I grew up on Wythe Place. It's 171st Street between the Grand Concourse and Walton Avenue. It's like a little dead-end street. Wasn't then. Well, I'm 66. So we're talking about 1960s. It wasn't middle class then. The Cross Bronx Expressway kind of destroyed the middle class in the Bronx. They all moved to Left Rack City or to Co-op City, or Queens. They made Ollie out of Queens. But my parents, they were poor, very poor. My father was a gambler, so common refrain was, if we wanted something, we'll have to see how your father does at cards tonight. There was no money. Yeah.
It sounds like your first manuscript was almost a form of catharsis, and I'm curious how it compares to the final product, to the published book. How different is the book from what you first wrote?
Let me read. So in case you couldn't hear that, she's asking how different the first manuscript, which was handwritten, correct, was, how that had changed, if at all, when it became published.
Well, it was 1,200 pages in handwritten, and then I put it on computer and began to edit heavily. The manuscript I brought into the publisher was about 750 pages. It was too long. I recognized that it was too long. And so Fred and I sat down and said, well, what can we cut here? And I pretty much knew, what would be, unnecessary to the story. So now it's at 420 pages, which is just right. And it kind of, I made it so that it accelerates to the end in these short kind of glimpses into what's going to happen.
Yeah.
In the beginning, you were talking about luck, and in the stories that you had said, these twists of fate where your mother got out, did she perceive herself as a lucky person because of that?
No, but she was haunted by guilt of survival. I don't think she understood why she was alive. My brother and I were her raison d'etre. And I write about that in Jew Boy. What a poor victory over Hitler my brother and I were. You know, it was a heavy burden to carry. My mother used to say, "You're my victory over Hitler."
Did she ever say why they were the only two that got off one city later?
I mean, that was just, that was instincts. Instinct told them, stay with the army, with the Italian army. The Italian army were fleeing from, were heading down to Sicily. They wanted to meet up with they had turned and wanted to meet up with the American army to battle against the Germans in Sicily. Something told her to stay, told them to stay, and they stayed, and it turned out to be, it saved their life. I went back to there. I went to Monte. I met the family that saved my mother.
Yeah, it's funny when
The Macchio family. Here's an interesting little note. The Macchio family, they lived in a little tiny place called San Pons in the mountains, outside of Demonte. And so, you know, I met them, and it turns out that they are not originally Italian, that the people in San Pons were from Spanish mercenaries who came over the mountains in the 19th century fleeing from Napoleon. They fought against Napoleon, lost, and they fled. They were mercenaries. So they were very martial people, and they look different than Italians. They have a very kind of, you know, like some kind of Hemingway Spanish-looking faces, you know. They are very martial. They showed me the house. They showed me where they hid my mother and grandmother. They showed me the house was the gathering place for the resistance leaders to get together, and you know, he showed the walls were incredibly thick so that they could block bullets. And yeah, they were Spanish mercenaries from the 19th century in this little town. I mean, what's the odds, you know? These people flee from Napoleon and save my mother? I mean, and none of it makes sense.
I was going to say that I grew up with a lot of different survivors, my father's family, and friends. They befriended a lot of survivors where we grew up. And it's the question of luck is always an interesting one, because I feel like it always depends on who you talk to, you know. And some of the survivors would say it was, you know, their wits, that they were smart, they were stronger than the other guy, they made all the right decisions. And I think some would say that it was pure luck every step of the way. And then probably the truth of it was someplace in the middle for all of them. You know, I mean, there are stories of my grandmother making decisions for her family that there's no way she could have known that the train they were about to get on was going to get blown up at the next stop. She just made a decision, you know, and you can call it luck, you can call it, you know, some other divine intervention or whatever you want to call it, but it's almost impossible to say, I would imagine, you know.
Yeah, anybody who claimed that they toughed it through the Holocaust is...
And that's it.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's our last question. Okay.
Can you expound on your premise that never again is happening again, and would you expand on what you think the leftist side of the bias is?
Well, you know, I don't want to identify the left as the sole proprietor of this problem. It's left and right. And it's the two sides of the coin. I think that it goes back to an old argument that you know, existed between the Bund, which I know about, Abraham Kahan, and between the Socialist Bund and the Zionists. They were arguing with each other in the Warsaw Ghetto as people were being deported to the death camps. They were fighting with each other, arguing with each other when the Germans were marching down the street about whether or not they should join forces or not. There's always been this very, very deep divide between the Bund and the Zionists and the left and the right. So even in our own camp, among our own people, we have this. I mean, I've met people who Jews who hate Israel. And it's like, how could you possibly hate Israel? They do. And they think that they have legitimate cause. You know, so when I see that, you know, then people on the left have their reasons, right? I just want to say this, my last thought, is that I'm not claiming that Israel is fair or unfair. But as a child of a survivor, I know and I recognize that Israel does what it needs to do to survive, and that as in the Holocaust, what you needed to do to survive was often not pretty, and not ethical, and not fun. But you lived. The victory is that Israel exists. People don't get that. You know, it's not, you say France exists, so. The United States exists, so. But to say Israel exists is an improbability, historically impossible thing. Israel is historically impossible. It can't possibly exist, and yet it does. And I was there, and I saw what's arrayed against Israel. You know, not just in public opinion, but in, you know, the actual martial forces that are surrounding it that want to destroy it. It's incredible that they survived. You know, when I served in 2003, you could see, you know, where I was, where we were in a combat-rich area, you could see over there to, you know, Tel Aviv. I mean, you could look and see, you know, other cities. It's like, wow, it's that close. You cross the road and you're in the war. That's how close it is. It's a tiny little country. It's constantly embattled, and it has to do what it has to do to survive. And the right may not like it, and the left may not like it, but Israelis are doing what they have to do, as Holocaust survivors did what they had to do to survive. And, you know, we're not morally accountable to anyone. How can we be morally accountable to anyone after the Holocaust? Who is anyone to say that we are wrong and that what we do is wrong? We don't. Here's my message. We don't care. We are going to live no matter what they say, no matter what they do. So.
All right, I think that's all we have time for, yeah?
Thank you.
Thanks.